The Resident Evil series is probably the most famous survival horror video game series out there. If you're watching this, you probably already know that, but published by Capcom, there have been at least 10 mainline games in the series, not including spin-offs, and I'm here to rank them. I have played nearly every mainline game, and I'll get to that in a second. There will be a couple missing, but I'll explain why. So like I said, I won't be discussing any of the spin-offs. This will just be mainline only. The only games that will be missing from this list are the original Resident Evil 2 and the original Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica. I've never personally played those games. I've watched people play them, but I don't think I am the right person to be putting them on the list. However, I would like to start a discussion, so anyone who watches this, please tell me where you would place these in the list, if you've played them of course, and yeah, we'll get right into it. So starting off, at number 9 on my list, so the Resident Evil 3 remake looks great, plays great, but it's short, very short. It's basically a glorified expansion of the Resident Evil 2 remake. I wouldn't be surprised if that was actually the case and that Capcom forced the release to be a separate game. There's a lot missing. While I said I haven't played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I have seen people play it, I've seen cutscenes, I've seen everything, I've done everything but play the game myself, and it just doesn't compare. The reason it's this low, right at the bottom of my list, is because it's so short. A few games on this list probably don't have the quality that 3 Remake has, but they have a lot more in terms of quantity, and I mean a lot more. There's not much more to say about Remake. There was some good boss battles, but not great. Nemesis was fun, but not quite to the level of Mr. X in Remake 2. Not much else to say. A bit disappointing. I really hope for better from Capcom with the upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake, but we'll discuss that a bit later on.
Resident Evil 6.
Resident Evil 6. Now, this is probably a lot of people's least favourite, and of the mainline non-remakes, yes, it is my least favourite as well. I really juggled putting Resident Evil 5 and 6 in that position, so I've kind of spoiled what I put at 7, but we'll get to that anyway. 6 tried to have variety. It had 4 different stories, and they all, while trying to be different, stayed the same. They weren't exactly what they should have been, and the reason I put this lower is because recently I did a playthrough of every Resident Evil game that you'll see on this list. Obviously not 2, 3 and Veronica. I never quite got my hands on any of those, sadly, but I did play through each and every one of these games during lockdown, and after, obviously, for a few of them. But yeah, 6 was the one game I did not finish when I got to it. It's the only game on the list I didn't play through completely. That is because I'd played through it before. I haven't just put it on the list because I haven't completed it. I have completed it before, but I got to it, played a little bit of Leon's story, and got kind of bored and didn't pick it up again. That wasn't to say that I wouldn't have, it's just other things came out and they took priority, and then when I had the chance to go back, I decided not to because I wasn't ultimately that interested, and that's something I can't really say for any other game on this list, except maybe 5. There just wasn't enough. I think the story was serviceable. I don't think it was the best. I don't think Resident Evil's top qualities are its story a lot of the time, but when your story is a little bit lackluster and the gameplay isn't much better, there isn't really a middle ground here. It's one of the worst mainline Resident Evil games, and I'm sure no one's really going to disagree there. We haven't got to the controversial parts just yet. One of the other reasons Resident Evil 6 is not my favourite is because of the QuickTime events. I'm usually someone who doesn't mind QuickTime events, but the game was predominantly that. Everything felt like it had to have a QuickTime event. Every moment felt like you had to be waiting and waiting. It felt like a Telltale game, and I love Telltale games, but Resident Evil is not a Telltale game, so it shouldn't have to rely on gimmicks like this. It's a survival horror game at the end of the day, and that's part of the reason I was disappointed. Like I said, the gameplay was lackluster. That was one of the elements that was predominant in 6, and ultimately led to the gameplay being quite boring and lackluster, like I said.
Resident Evil 5.
So in 7th place, Resident Evil 5. 5 is very divisive for me. I played it when I was quite young, when it first came out. Played a bit of it co-op and enjoyed it. And then I replayed it and realised it wasn't as bad as people made it out to be, but it wasn't great. The reason it beat 6 is simply because it gave in to all this zaniness, the craziness. We got to see Chris Redfield punch a boulder in a volcano. There's not much. I don't know what they were thinking with this game, but they just gave in to the craziness, and I kind of respect it. The gameplay was nothing special. It felt like the game was made with mercenaries and multiplayer co-op in mind. That was like their sole objective with this game, and I think it hurt it more than anything. Even if some of those elements are things that people love, I think the main game really suffered because of that, and that's the reason I put it at 7th.
Resident Evil 0.
Now, 6th on my list is a game that probably not many people have played. It's probably the least popular Resident Evil on in the mainline franchise, and that is 0. Now, 0 is an interesting game. It also tried a gimmick with the 2 playable characters, and I think ultimately it was really interesting and quite works for me. The game's set around the same time as Resident Evil 1, and it really feels like it. They're very similar in their styles, but they have their own unique feeling, and I really enjoyed 0. What lets it down is there was a bit of a... I don't mind difficult games, but there were some weird difficulty spikes in here. I also don't think the main characters were as interesting as Resident Evil 1, for example, but it wasn't a bad game. It is very middle of the road for me, and I would happily replay it in a few years' time.
Resident Evil 4.
Now we get to some controversy. Yes, I put Resident Evil 4 at 5th on my list. I know, don't kill me. But upon replaying it recently, the game hasn't aged very well, and a lot of people will be like, well, obviously it's 18-20 years old at this point, and I totally am with you on that. If we were doing it by release, then that's a different story. Resident Evil 4 pretty much revolutionized not just the franchise, but the genre as a whole, and it deserves the respect for that. But I don't think it's better than the rest of the games on this list, and yeah. I think the boss fights are fun. I think they're good. I don't think they've aged as well as many have thought. I think the story for the most part isn't bad. Of course, you know, it's not exactly the pinnacle, but like I said, Resident Evil's not really story focused for the most part. It's more about the survival horror aspect, and Resident Evil 4 really captures that in a different way. It was different to the earlier entries in the franchise, not on this list, but in the franchise, where it took a more action approach. And I don't know how I feel about that. I think they've definitely improved upon it with recent releases, but 4 was the basis for all that, and it deserves the respect that many people give it. I actually find the Resident Evil 4 gameplay to be quite stiff, a bit janky. I wasn't a big fan when going back to play it, and that's kind of one of the other reasons it's lower down on the list. I'm really hoping the Resident Evil 4 remake capitalizes on the success of Resident Evil 4 and of the recent remakes as well, and kind of delivers a game that doesn't disappoint. A lot of people will not want the original Resident Evil 4 spoiled. I think it's due an update, but with this being a remake and with what we've seen with 2 remake and 3 remake, I expect this to be a little different, and I'm interested, I really am. But the original Resident Evil 4 is staying at 5th on my list for now, and we'll see what I put above it.
Biohazard 7.
So Resident Evil 7 is fantastic. It's one of my favourite games in the franchise. Pretty much everything above 5th on my list are top tier games that could probably be swapped around, but 7 was really hard to rank at 4, by the way. I actually think it could be higher. Like I said, it could be swapped around, but I have my reasons for putting it here. I think the story was great. I think the survival horror aspect was fantastic. It's one of the, I wouldn't say scarier, but it really felt intense at times. I think the setting was brilliant. I think the story for the most part was good. The thing that let the game down a lot were the bosses. I'm not a big fan of how the boss fights turned out personally, but I really do love the game, and I think it has some great DLC as well. And I do recommend any fan of survival horror who maybe have never played the Resident Evil games before, I think Resident Evil 7's a great jumping on point. You don't really need to know much about the franchise. There's only one returning character really that you should know about, but 7's just a brilliant game, and you should go ahead and play it. Music is great as well. Everything just feels awesome.
Resident Evil.
So 3rd on my list, I have the Resident Evil 1 remake. You might realise I put the remake here instead of the classic game. I think the remake's just the classic, but way better, and with an even better storyline, which I won't spoil. I mean story feature that I won't spoil. But yeah, I think it's fully deserving, and honestly could even be 2nd on the list if we were restructuring. But I really love this game. Obviously it kicked off the series with a bang, and the remake was even better. It's cheesy, campy, and still filled with horror aspects, and it's what you should love about the series. It really is what the series was and should be, and it really captures that survival horror feel that has been sorely missing within gaming. Missing recently within gaming, this was the start, but it's what I want to see and what I like to see from remakes. And it's just a really fun game to play. Puzzles are awesome, gameplay was awesome. It's not as stiff as Resident Evil 4 was in terms of its gameplay. But yeah, the style of gameplay really suits it, and you can get away with more in this style of game. Fixed camera positions, you know, stuff like that. But I really like the story, I really love the setting, it being in the mansion, and as you can tell probably, I really like these focused settings for games. So yeah, Resident Evil 1 remake, really recommend. If you're not going to start at Resident Evil 7, might as well go right to the start and start at 1, specifically the remake, because it's just the best way to play the game. Now, number 2 on my list is the most recent entry into the mainline franchise, and that's Resident Evil 8 Village. I don't know if a lot of people actually agree with this, but Village is my favourite non-remake Resident Evil. I have many reasons for that, and graphically it's stunning. Gameplay-wise, it's probably the best game in the series. For that, not counting what's number 1 on the list. I think that's really good competition, but 8 is just a fantastic game. The reason it's number 2 specifically is the variety. Every single section of this game felt different, and it did what Resident Evil 6 should have done. There's parts that are taken from a Resident Evil 2 that feel more akin to that. There are parts that feel more like Resident Evil 4, the action-based stuff. Especially, there's a part in Resident Evil 4 where you're in a house and you have to survive, and there's a section in Resident Evil 8 which is very similar to that. It also has one of the scariest sequences in any Resident Evil game, maybe even the scariest overall. And yeah, it's just brilliant how they've brought everything together and created what I consider to be a horror masterpiece. It is something that Capcom should look at and realise, wow, we did so well here. While there are improvements to be made, 8 is pretty much the pinnacle of the mainline series, first person at least.
Resident Evil 2.
Now, we'll get on to number 1, the Resident Evil 2 remake. Resident Evil 2 remake really revitalised my love for the series. I'd been a bit out of touch. I'd obviously played 4 before, I played 1 remake, I played 7, 6 and 5, but I'd never obviously played 2 and 3, and this was my chance to play a version of 2. Now, I will start off with a criticism for Resident Evil 2 remake, and it's something I know fans of the original will understand, and probably a lot of people will put the original Resident Evil 2 at number 1 or 2, and if I'd played it, it'd probably be up there as well. But Capcom really dropped the ball when it came to presenting a different story in a second act, second part, second playthrough. Resident Evil 2 has like Leon A, Claire A, Leon B, Claire B, and you usually pick Leon A and then you'll play Claire B, or vice versa. And they didn't really do that here. They did it, but the stories were just kind of similar. You know, Leon A and Claire A are pretty much the same as Leon B and Claire B. Like, while the two are kind of distinct, they do different things. You're not really getting a different experience, say if you played Leon A and Leon B. But if you played Leon A and Claire B, you probably get that different feeling. It's just not what the original had, and what I've seen online, what I've watched from the original, it's kind of disappointing. But at the same time, if we look past all that, gameplay wise, story wise, survival horror aspect wise, this is by far the best Resident Evil game we've had in years. It just felt great. I had friends who played it and loved it the same as me, and like I said, it revitalized my love for the franchise at a time where it's not getting much love outside of the video games. Well, I'll have a little bit of a mini discussion about that after this, but yeah, 2 Remake is fantastic, and I really do recommend anyone go in there and give it a go. This is also another jumping on point for the franchise. It has no real connection to the rest of the games. Obviously, Resident Evil 1 would be the one before this, but it doesn't really have much of a connection other than references here and there. It sort of starts Leon's story rather than Chris's, so it's definitely something that fans can jump into at any time and not feel lost. And I feel like Resident Evil is pretty good at that, creating games that, while still connected, fans can jump in at any point and not feel like they're missing out much. And I really enjoy that, even though I do like some continuity in my series. But this is a remake, so it's not too bad. But yeah, that's my list. I know I didn't go into too much detail with each entry, otherwise this video would have been way longer, but that is the basis of what I believe to be the top games in the series, not counting 2 and 3. I want to make that clear. I haven't put the original 2 and 3 or Code Veronica on that list because I haven't played them and I felt it'd be unfair, but I felt I'd played enough of the Resident Evil franchise to at least give my opinion and give people that have never played the series a bit of a spoiler-free look at where they could jump in at and what my personal favourites are. So while I said any of these can be jumped in at, I would recommend starting at Resident Evil 1 Remake and working your way up. There are a few you might want to skip, specifically 5 and 6 if you're not really into those sort of action-orientated games, but I would definitely say the top 5 games on this list are must-plays for anyone, especially fans who, like me, may have dipped out of the franchise at one point. The reason I also made this list is because of the recent release of the Netflix series. Some people might have seen it. I have basically refused to watch it. Not refused, it's just another one of the missed opportunities for Resident Evil fans, and don't really understand why everyone seems to be wanting to do their own poor twist on the series when there's so much lore, so much they could take from the series, and they just create utter rubbish most of the time. But I want to start a discourse and basically want to hear what everyone thinks about the series, what everyone thinks about the Netflix series as well. Maybe convince me to watch it if you think it's any good. And let me know if you think I should pick up the original 2 and 3 and Code Veronica and play them at any point. I have better equipment now, so I'll be able to run them on whatever I can. I hope you've enjoyed. Leave a like, comment, tell me if you want me to do any more discussion or ranking videos like this. I know we're not a big channel, but we try and think of content that could be relevant, and I thought this was probably the most relevant time in a little while to do a Resident Evil video this type. So yeah, like I said, let us know what you'd like to see, and I'll see you next time.